Raise your hand if you've ever filled out a form and thought, why does this exist? Keep it up if that form was about internal controls. Yeah, that's what I thought. Now, what if I told you those forms existed because of something that happened in the 1980s? Well, a clerk at a federal agency added fake names to the payroll, issued herself time cards for people who didn't exist, and walked out with $17,000 in checks over several months. And nobody noticed. Not the supervisor, not the accountant, not the auditor. And here's the part that should keep you all up at night. When investigators finally caught her, they found 2 more employees doing the exact same thing in the same office. Total losses from the first clerk, $17,000. But when investigators dug deeper, they found the full extent. 3 total employees running similar schemes. Total fraud from that one office, over $112,000. But the real loss wasn't the money. It was the answer investigators kept hearing when they asked, how did this happen? The answer always the same. Nobody was checking. Let's go back for a moment, way back. Back in the 1970s and early 1980s, the federal government was dealing with a problem that was becoming impossible to ignore. Programs were expanding quickly, money was moving fast, and oversight hadn't caught up. At the same time, investigators and auditors at the Government Accountability Office, then called the General Accounting Office, started publishing reports that were unsettling. They weren't talking about small paperwork errors. They documented cases where federal money was routed through fake vendors, where invoices were created for work that never happened, where grant funds were diverted to completely unrelated purposes and no one noticed for years. In some programs, GAO found that money moved through accounts with so little tracking that investigators could not clearly answer 3 basic questions. Who approved it? Where did it go? And who was responsible for stopping it? These weren't edge cases. GAO described thousands of fraud cases across federal programs in over just a few years. But the most important conclusion wasn't that fraud existed. It was this. Fraud thrived where internal controls were weak, or where no one in management was clearly responsible for them. In other words, this wasn't just an audit problem. This was a management problem. And that realization is what gave us the framework we're talking about today. The Federal Managers Financial Integrity Act of 1982, known as FMFIA, Standards for Internal Control in the Federal Government, which everyone calls the Green Book, and Office of Management and Budget Circular A-123, or just A-123. Think of them as the government's version of a health code, created after too many people got sick, and no one could quite explain how it happened. So let's make this simple, because if this part isn't clear, everything else is going to feel like alphabet soup. So here's the chain. FMFIA is the law. It's Congress saying, agency leadership, you are responsible for internal control at your agency. The Green Book is the standards. It answers the question, what does good internal control actually look like in the federal government? And OMB Circular A-123 is the playbook. It tells management how to organize, assess, monitor, and improve internal controls in the real world. Laws, standard, and playbook. If you've ever wondered why internal control work feels unavoidable, this is why. It didn't start as a best practice. It started as a legal requirement created after reports from the Government Accountability Office showed what happens when no one is clearly accountable. Once you see this chain, a lot of things start to click and fall into place. Why leadership signs an assurance statement every year, why auditors keep coming back to the same themes, why documentation, monitoring, and follow-up matter more than just clever controls. You're not doing this work because somebody likes forms or processes. You're doing it because the system was designed to force one simple outcome. Management must know whether its controls work and be willing to say so out loud. Let's talk about why this matters to you personally, no matter what role you have in the federal government. Every year, agency leadership signs something called a Statement of Assurance or Assurance Statement. It's a formal statement saying whether internal controls are working or whether there are weaknesses that need to be disclosed. This signature is not ceremonial. It's leadership putting their name on the line and saying, we understand our risks and we believe our controls are doing what they should be doing, or saying when they're not. That confidence doesn't come from one office or one report. It's built from lots of smaller pieces. You have process walkthroughs, controls testing, risk assessments, issue tracking, corrective action plans, and follow-ups. In other words, it's built from the work done by people like you. When auditors report a finding, when a material weakness shows up, when leadership has to explain an issue to OMB, GAO, or Congress. Those outcomes trace back often to FMFIA and A-123, even if your day-to-day work doesn't feel policy or controls heavy. Understanding this framework will give you leverage. It helps you explain why a control exists. It helps you push back when a control doesn't match the risk. And it helps you connect your work to the decisions leadership actually care about. You're not just supporting a process, you're supporting the assurance that the organization knows what it's doing and can prove it. Let's talk about FMFIA itself. The Federal Managers Financial Integrity Act was passed in 1982, right after years of fraud reports from the Government Accountability Office made one thing painfully clear. The problem wasn't just that fraud existed. The problem was that no one in management was required to step back and say whether their internal control systems actually worked. So FMFIA did something very deliberate. It didn't say eliminate fraud. It didn't say guarantee no mistakes or create a perfect system. Instead, it set 3 expectations for agency leadership. 1, establish internal controls. That means don't operate on trust alone. Put structure around how work is done. 2, evaluate those controls. Not once, not informally, but deliberately, with the goal of understanding whether they are designed appropriately and actually functioning. And 3, report on those results every year in writing with your agency's head attached to it. That last piece is key. FMFIA forces management to stop hiding behind complexity. It requires leadership to say out loud, here's what we know about our controls. Now back to our bakery example. FMFIA isn't a cleaning checklist. It's a law. It says you must be able to tell the health department whether your kitchen is safe and explain why. You don't get to say, I assume it's fine. You don't get to say, somebody else handles it. You don't get to say, we haven't found anything yet. You have to own it. FMFIA tells management you're responsible for internal control. The next question most leaders asked back in the 1980s was predictable. Okay, that sounds good, but what does a good internal control actually mean? Well, that's why the Government Accountability Office issued and was required to create what's called the Green Book, or the Standards for Internal Control in the Federal Government. The Green Book does not give you a checklist, though. It doesn't say here are the 10 controls every agency must have. Instead, it gives the federal government a common standard. At a high level, it lays out these things: 5 components that make up internal control, 17 principles underneath those components, and attributes that describe what an effective internal control system would look like. Now, you're new to this, so here's a key point. The Green Book is not about perfection. It's about reasonableness. It gives everyone, management, auditors, GAO, OMB, a shared language for answering a question. Does this internal control system make sense for the risks involved? Now, I want to note some timing just for your awareness. The 2014 Green Book applied all the way through FY25, but the new revision that came out in 2025 became effective in FY26. You don't need to memorize either versions, though you need to understand what roles it plays. So let's go back to our bakery analogy. The Green Book is our food safety standards. It doesn't tell you which brand of thermometer to buy, but it does say make sure food is cooked to a safe temperature. It doesn't tell you who should clean the counters, but it does say counters should be clean. That's a Green Book's job. Defines what healthy looks like, and let management decide how to get there. So far, we've talked about the law and the standards. Now we get the document that makes people either roll their eyes or breathe a sigh of relief. It's OMB Circular A-123. A-123 is titled Management's Responsibility for Enterprise Risk Management and Internal Control. A lot of people hear A-123 and immediately think, oh, that's the internal control over financial reporting thingy. And that's understandable, but it's really incomplete. A-123 is not just about financial statements. It's about how management runs the organization responsibly. A-123 tells agencies how to organize internal control government, how to go about assessing risk, how to test and monitor controls, track and fix deficiencies, and critically, it directs you how to think about fraud risks, not just accounting errors. This goes all the way back to the environment FMFIA was born in. Congress wasn't reacting to just bad math. They were reacting to systems that made fraud easy and accountability fuzzy. A-123 keeps that concern alive by requiring agencies to look across programs, think proactively about risks, and document how management knows their controls are working. A-123 also evolves. A-123 updates through memos and appendices, especially in areas like data reliability, reporting integrity, and risk management. That's why one of the more practical habits you can have is always check to make sure that you're using the current version of A-123, as these do change and have additions from time to time. So let's go back to our bakery analogy again. A-123, it isn't health law. It's not food and safety standards. It's more the bakery's operating manual. It tells you who to clean, how inspections should happen, what things you need to do when something goes wrong, and how to prove later that you were paying attention to all these steps and having a safe and healthy bakery. At this point, there's an important line we need to draw clearly, because a lot of frustration in internal control work comes from mixing up two very different roles: management internal control assessors and financial statement auditors. Here's a distinction. Is directed by FMFIA and OMB A-123 and uses the Green Book to design controls, operate those controls, monitor them, and fix them when they don't work. That responsibility exists whether an auditor shows up or not. Auditors, on the other hand, they could use the same framework, but really for a different purpose. You'll often see them using these laws, standards, and regulations as criteria for their findings and their test procedures. They're asking, does this control design make sense? Is there evidence it operated? And has management responded appropriately to problems they've identified? Now, remember though, auditors don't own your controls. They don't run your processes, and they don't get to decide your risk tolerance. They evaluate what management chooses to do, or sometimes not to do. Now back to our bakery example. Management runs a kitchen every day. They decide the layout, the cleaning schedule, the staffing. The health inspector, though, they don't cook. They don't tell you what brand of soap to buy. They just show up and ask, does this kitchen meet the health code? Now, when those roles blur, things may break down. Management starts designing controls just to please auditors. Auditors get pulled into operational decisions. Maybe they really shouldn't be. FMFIA and A-123 are designed to prevent that by making one thing unmistakable. Management is responsible for the internal control systems. Auditors are just there to evaluate it. So let's pull everything together. Up to now, we've talked about these documents one at a time. This slide is where we lock them into place. Think of them as layers. On top, you see the health law. That's FMFIA. It says, if you run a bakery, you're responsible for keeping people safe. No instruction yet, just accountability. Next, you have the food safety standards. The Green Book defines what safe mean: clean surfaces, proper temperatures, separation of duties, ongoing monitoring. Still no step-by-step instructions, just clear expectations. Finally, you have the Operation Manual, or A-123. It explains what you should do, how often you should assess risk, what happens if something goes wrong, and how you'll know and how management knows their system is actually working. Each layer depends on the one below it. If you skip the law, there's no accountability. If you skip the standards, there's no definition of good. And if you skip the manual, there's not going to be anything happening consistently, and especially consistently across the entire federal government. This is why internal control work feels so structured. It's not accidental. It's layered on purpose. And once you see it this way, it's much easier to explain to others, especially people don't live in this world of internal controls every day. Let's stay with this bakery analogy one more moment. Now imagine a bakery ignores the health law, the standards, and they're operating a manual. At first, nothing dramatic probably happens. A cleaning log gets skipped, temperature checks just become assumed. Documentation feels optional because everyone's busy. And for a while, maybe it works. But that's how weak control systems usually fail. They fail quietly. Over time, small problems start to stack up. Food sits out too long. Inventory goes missing. No one can explain exactly why, and then a customer gets sick. Complaints come in. And eventually the health inspectors show up, and at this point, it doesn't matter that the bakery meant well. What matters is they can't demonstrate control. Federal agencies work the same way. Weak internal controls don't usually explode overnight. They just erode confidence and efficiency slowly until something triggers attention. Could be an audit finding. It could be a whistleblower. Maybe it's data error that's posted publicly. Or, worst case, a program failure that makes headlines. That's when consequences showed up. Findings and material weaknesses, reputational damage, increased oversight, and in some cases, restricted authority and external intervention. FMFIA, the Green Book, and A-123 aren't about avoiding mistakes. They exist to make sure mistakes are caught, understood, and fixed before they become a public problem. Bakery example again. The goal isn't a perfect kitchen and bakery. The goal isn't a perfect bakery. The goal is a bakery where management knows what's happening and can prove it. Up to now, we've talked about the law, standard, and guidance. This is where we bring it back to something very concrete. If you take nothing else from this module, take this. Internal controls only work when ownership is clear. So here's an exercise you can do at your own agency. Ask 2 questions. First, who owns the FMFIA assurance statement? The agency head is ultimately accountable. For the Department of Justice, the Attorney General actually signs the assurance statement, and you can find this at the latest agency financial report. Second, who runs A-123 assessments? Now, it's going to vary from agency to agency, but you can ask yourself the question, is it an internal control office? Maybe it's a risk office. Do you have a risk management function? Could it be within the Office of Chief Financial Officer? Do you have a dedicated team, or maybe you even outsource it to contractors to perform with government oversight? Now, if you can't answer those questions easily, it's not a failure. It just means you can ask some questions next time you're in the office and figure out where exactly that function lies, because every executive branch agency has this function. Back to our bakery example. You have to ask yourself, who's responsible that the bakery is safe? Is it the baker? Is it the clerk working the register? Or is it the owner? It's going to be the owner. Same thing as your agency with your agency head. Your top leader is responsible for internal controls at their agency. Now, before we move on, let's pause for just a quick little check. It's not a test, just a way we make sure we've just talked about is stuck. First question. What law requires federal agencies to establish, evaluate, and report on internal controls? That's FMFIA, the law that puts responsibility squarely on management. Second question. Which document provides the internal control standards for the federal government? That's the Green Book. It defines what good internal control look like without prescribing exact controls. And 3, which OMB circular guides management on how to implement, assess, and monitor internal control and risk, in turn including fraud risk? Now that's OMB Circular A-123, the playbook that turns responsibility and standards into daily practice. If you can answer these 3 questions, you understand the backbone of the entire internal control framework. Everything else, testing, walkthroughs, findings, they all just build on this. Here's the thing. Most people working in the federal agency will never make this connection from FMFIA to the background, to the Green Book, to A-123, but you will. And it'll help you stay ahead of the curve because you'll see the bigger picture and you see how you fit in the work you do help support your agency. All right, that brings us to the end of today's discussion. In our next module, we're going to go deeper into what the Green Book is and what are the components of internal controls. I want to say thank you for listening, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want high quality federal focused CPE, check us out at www.federalfinancecpe.com and register, and you get your first course automatically free.